What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. Sorry I haven't made a video in a while, but I've not been idle. Been just busting my butt on my podcast, Wrong Reel, which you can see in the show notes down below. The most recent episode, 250, was a really cool one where I got to talk to David Proval and Federico Castelluccio, who are two actors from the show The Sopranos, as well as the creators involved in this new film called The Brooklyn Banker. So if you like these videos, please consider checking out my podcast, which you can find below. The most recent episode I'm very proud of. But I'm back to review episode 11 of The Expanse, an episode called Here There Be Dragons. And that's an allusion to how way back in the day on maps where they had unknown spaces or unexplored territory, they would sometimes put symbols of dragons there, saying here there be dragons or here be dragons. And this show is definitely entering into unexplored territory, both in terms of the content for the characters, as well as some of the changes they've made to the books, which I will be discussing at the very end of the video, because I know some people aren't remotely interested in hearing about that. One last note before I get started. Since this show's drawn to a close, I've been looking for new shows to follow to review on this channel. And the last few weeks, I've been getting caught up on The Leftovers as well as Fargo, both of which start in about 2 weeks' time. So I've seen season 1 of both. Now I'm working on season 2 of both. So as my reviews on The Expanse draw to a close, I'll be picking up with those two shows. So my TV reviews will continue uninterrupted. But let's talk about episode 11. Episode 11 is one of my favorite episodes of this season, but there's a part of it that also makes it one of my least favorite. But once again, I will save that for the very end when I'm comparing and contrasting with the book, because for the most part, this episode got the action going again, gave us some crucial information. As I've said in some of my previous reviews, I've been a little frustrated with the pacing ever since episode 5, because 6 through 10 are obviously all the build-up toward this huge climax is coming, both with episode 11, 12, and 13 in 2 weeks' time. And we got a little taste of that today, both with Bobby Draper's storyline as well as with Holden's crew down on Ganymede. The really cool thing about this episode is we see a lot of flashbacks dealing with the character of May, the daughter of Dr. Prax. May was kidnapped before the incident on Ganymede went down, and it's all tied together. And spoiler alert, as we see in this episode, she's part of an elaborate series of experiments where they're taking children with these immune deficiencies and experimenting on them and turning them into weapons. And now we know they're basically using the proto-molecule and these children to create these super soldiers that they're planning on selling to the highest bidder. And it looks as if Jules Pierre Mao is behind all of it, and that Mars desperately wants to buy these superpowered weapons. But for me, this show is always at its best when it explores the dark side of what's going to happen to us as a species now that the proto-molecule is present in our solar system. Obviously, the arrival of the proto-molecule is a total game changer, and there's no going back. The question is, in what ways will it affect us and force us to evolve, both to combat it or to live alongside it? And if you've read some of the books, then you know exactly where the proto-molecule is going. But one of the cool things about the show is that it keeps us perpetually in absolute fear and terror about the power of the proto-molecule. And that's what originally drew me into the show, and what prompted me to read the books was my fascination with the proto-molecule. So back on Earth, we see Bobby is really resisting the yoke of her commanding officer, who's basically lying to her about what happened to her on Ganymede and forcing her to play along. And eventually she just completely freaks out, wants to know exactly what happened, beats the hell out of her commanding officer, wants more information, and he essentially spills the beans on everything that's going on. She's like, fuck this, beats the hell out of another guy, escapes, and seeks political asylum with the United Nations, aka Earth. So now she and Christian Avasarala are now on the same team, and she's no longer a Martian Marine. She's working with Christian, trying to figure out what's going to happen. And I apologize, I know I always call her Christian, it's Chris Yen, but it's just, for whatever reason, it's spelled Chrisjen, so I just pronounce it Christian. At any rate, they're now on the same team, but at the same time, Jules Pierre Mao has reached out to Christian and wants to meet with her at a place of his choosing, away from UN influence, because he wants to talk about what he's been doing with the proto-molecule, his role in these experiments. So all these political machinations and maneuverings are starting to come to a head with, obviously, and Christian just wants to get to the bottom of what the hell's going on and who she can trust and who she can't. But obviously Bobby now is on her side. We get some great footage of what's going on with the Arbogast out at Venus. The Arbogast is the ship that's trying to monitor what's going on with the protomolecule there. And after several failed probes being launched down to the surface, they finally find a way to shield one and get closer to the surface. They drop it down there, and for a couple seconds they get live footage from the surface of Venus, and it's the protomolecule totally unleashed, transforming the environment, doing all sorts of crazy things. But before they get a really good look, the probe gets absorbed by the protomolecule, because as we know, the protomolecule takes any sort of technology or organic matter or fuel and reworks it to whatever goals and objectives it may have. If you've read the books, you know what those goals are, but I will not spoil what the protomolecule is trying to do. But as always, I just love watching the protomolecule in action. It's terrifying and fascinating all at once. We get some more great lighthearted footage in this episode of Alex out in space. And Alex, as we can see, is starting to have almost a love affair with the Rocinante. Refers to the two of them as we. They spend a lot of time alone together. And Alex is trying to figure out a way to rescue his friends in spite of the no-fly zone. And he comes up with this elaborate plan or scheme where he looks at the entire system as a whole and realizes that he can plot a course using the gravity of the various systems, where he won't have to use his engines, he'll just have to use his thrusters and allow the trajectory and the gravity to do most of the work to get him down to Ganymede undetected by virtue of the fact that he's not using his engines. So yeah, he loves his ship. He loves flying. It's just always a pleasure watching Alex in action, because he's just a very lovable dude. So finally, on Ganymede, we see Holden and his crew looking for May, and Holden is in full-blown, we got to destroy the protomolecule mode, and he's very clearly not concerned at all about the fact that his moral core is starting to slide a little bit, and he views it as, you know, essentially the ends justify the means when it comes to destroying the protomolecule. So he and Amos are starting to resemble each other a lot more. Naomi, you can tell, is pulling away and just no longer seems to recognize the man that she once loved. The station on Ganymede's rapidly shutting down faster than any of them predicted. Like air recycling systems and things like that are all being shut down, and basically all hell breaking loose just as they discovered this lab in the oldest part of the station where all these children are being experimented upon. Amos very foolishly gives Prax a gun, which when they find these scientists and soldiers who are controlling this experiment, it escalates very quickly, turns into a little shooting war. Amos pushes Prax out of the way, takes a bullet in the shoulder, but they also find one of the children that's been experimented upon, and it's pretty fucked up and evil and disgusting, because these are helpless, sick children that are being turned into living weapons, and Holden just completely incinerates it because he wants to eradicate the use of the protomolecule. But right then and there, a grenade gets thrown into the room. Amos, badass that he is, grabs a grenade, throws it back through the door, and shuts it behind it, and it blows up basically near the enemies, which causes all sorts of problems and chaos, because on the other side of the door is yet another one of these horrible creatures, which now gets loose, starts murdering scientists and murdering soldiers, rips its way out through an airlock, and runs out onto the surface of Ganymede. One of the scientists, as she dies, is asking for help. Holden wants information, and she basically laughs in his face and says, "If there are a lot more of those monsters, where that one came from." Naomi, at this point, decides Holden's no longer a person she wants to be involved with, and decides that she's going to stay on Ganymede and help with the relief efforts for the refugees. Holden kisses her goodbye and basically rounds up the troops and wants to continue hunting down every last scrap of the protomolecule in this series of experiments to turn all these children into weapons. Right then, Alex does arrive. He managed to get to the surface of Ganymede to rescue them, but as they're suiting up and getting ready to leave on the Rocinante, basically try to find those in charge of these experiments, they see that one of these protomolecule monsters is just strolling around on the surface of Ganymede without a suit, just a big naked blue dude walking around, and it's looking right at them. So obviously, at episode 12, things are going to come to a head very quickly with this creature. Now, great cliffhanger, great episode. That's all I'm going to say, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of the major changes, minor and major changes to the books that we are seeing in the show. Some of which are okay, some of which I like, some of which I don't like. But for me, my attitude always is, if you're going to make changes, fine, but make sure you make changes with a purpose. Do it for a reason. Make sure you're either trying to make an improvement or you're streamlining, but don't just make changes for their own sake. So There was one interesting bit where when Prax essentially causes the situation to escalate with the scientists and the military, I thought it was handled a little bit better in the books because they're having this confrontation, and suddenly Prax, who's trying to basically just make a point, cocks his gun, and that's the signal where the opposing forces open fire. Basically, everything's going according to plan until Prax, just due to his ignorance about how that gesture would be interpreted, causes this shooting war to break out. It's a little more ambiguous in this, where he essentially just has to like interject into the conversation, and that movement makes everybody open fire. So Prax is perhaps a little less stupid as depicted in the show, but I just thought that scene was perhaps handled a little bit better in the books, but no big deal. But the big change, obviously, is the timing where Naomi decides that she's not going to be hanging out with the crew anymore. It's a really weird time for her to choose, where basically there's these horrible creatures that are capable of wreaking all sorts of havoc and destruction, that would be the time where she decides she no longer wants to hang out with her friends and companions. I just find that very, very hard to believe. I mean, as depicted in the books, there is a similar scenario where she no longer wants to be involved with Holden because she feels like he's going into a very, very evil, dark place, and he kind of pulls back, and they have this great reconciliation, and they fall in love again, and blah, blah, blah. But it's while they're on a space station and they're safe in a time of relative calm where you can make these life-changing decisions. I just find it a little hard to believe that right in the middle of a total, complete crisis, she would choose that time to break up with her boyfriend. But maybe they've got a reason for doing it that way. I'm not going to really worry about it too much because I do enjoy the show overall, so I can handle some minor tweaks and changes here and there. And maybe there'll be a reason for it in episode 12 or 13 before the end of the season. But yeah, but it's sad there are only 2 episodes left to go. It's been a great ride. I'd say that I think season 2 has been the stronger of the 2 seasons, and just looking forward to season 3 sometime around this time next year. So hope you enjoyed this review and recap. Please subscribe to my channel if you did. And yeah, if you want to know what happens beyond all the chaos and confusion on the show, just read the books. The books are always there waiting to be discovered. And as always, I greatly appreciate you watching my channel. So long.